A clock echoes in the darkness. A single heartbeat joins it, slow, heavy. For 13 days in October 1962, the fate of humanity itself balanced on the edge of a blade. One wrong move, one misunderstood message, one soldier acting without orders, and the world we know, the cities we live in, the lives we lead, might have been reduced to ash. Across America, families built fallout shelters in their backyards. Children learned to duck beneath their desks, pretending thin wood could shield them from fire hotter than the sun. In Moscow, planners whispered of striking first, before the Americans did. In Havana, Fidel Castro, still defiant after surviving an invasion the year before, welcomed Soviet soldiers as protectors of his revolution. Every man, woman, and child on Earth was about to become a silent participant in the deadliest gamble in human history. This is the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest we have ever come to nuclear war. The Cold War had been building pressure for years, a conflict fought not on open battlefields but in whispers, spies, and the cold mathematics of missile ranges. The United States and the Soviet Union each claimed to defend freedom. Each saw themselves as the guardians of civilization, but both lived in the constant shadow of total annihilation. And then, there was Cuba. Just 90 miles from Florida, this small island had become a fault line in the struggle between superpowers. In 1959, Fidel Castro's revolution had overthrown the old U.S.-backed government. To Washington, this was a betrayal, a dangerous infection of communism spreading into the Western Hemisphere. To Moscow, it was an opportunity, a foothold in America's backyard. In April of 1961, the CIA-backed Bay of Pigs invasion had failed spectacularly. The plan was simple on paper: train Cuban exiles, send them ashore, and watch Castro fall. Instead, it ended in disaster. Cuban forces crushed the invasion, and Kennedy, barely 3 months into his presidency, was humiliated before the world. For Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, this was a revelation. America's young president had blinked. Perhaps he could be tested. But Khrushchev had deeper worries. American nuclear missiles were stationed in Turkey and Italy, close enough to strike Moscow in minutes. The Soviet Union, for all its military pride, was at a disadvantage. In a nuclear war, they would likely be destroyed first. So Khrushchev gambled. Under the cover of secrecy, he approved Operation Anadyr, the transfer of nuclear missiles, launch sites, and thousands of Soviet troops to Cuba. To him, this was balance, deterrence. If the Americans could threaten Russia from Turkey, then the Soviets could threaten America from Cuba. By late summer of 1962, Soviet freighters moved silently across the Atlantic. Their holds concealed long, steel tubes under layers of crates and tarps. Soldiers pretended to be agricultural specialists. At night, deep in the Cuban countryside, construction crews cleared fields and poured concrete, preparing the ground for weapons that could reach Washington, New York, and Chicago in less than 15 minutes. The gamble was underway, and the world had no idea, but soon it would. On the morning of October 14th, 1962, a U-2 reconnaissance plane sliced silently through the high clouds above Cuba. At over 70,000 feet, the pilot could see the curve of the Earth, but far below, his cameras were capturing something that no one yet dared imagine. Rows of long, thin shadows stretched across cleared fields, trucks, tents, construction equipment, and the outlines of something more ominous: missile launch pads under construction. When the film canisters were developed and laid out in a secure room in Washington, the evidence was undeniable. Soviet nuclear missiles were in Cuba. The photographs were spread across the table in the White House. Men leaned forward, squinting at the grainy black and white images. At first glance, they could have been barns, silos, warehouses. But to the trained eye of the CIA's analysts, they were unmistakable. Medium-range ballistic missile sites, capable of reaching deep inside the United States. President Kennedy was briefed the next day, October 16th. He listened in silence as the CIA detailed what they had found. The missiles were not yet armed, but once complete, they could deliver nuclear warheads to most major American cities: New York, Washington, Chicago, even as far as Dallas. The young president's face remained still, but inside he knew the stakes. This was not a distant crisis in Berlin, or Korea, or Vietnam. This was 90 miles from American shores. The room was tense. Advisors whispered. Generals shifted in their seats. Everyone understood. Once this news went public, once the world knew the Soviets had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, there would be no going back. Kennedy leaned back in his chair. The silence stretched. And then, softly, he gave his first order. "Bring in my senior advisors. We'll meet in secret." The stage was set. The most dangerous meetings in American history were about to begin. On the morning of October 16, 1962, President Kennedy gathered a hand-picked group of advisors in the cabinet room. They called themselves the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or simply the ExComm. In theory, this was just another meeting. In reality, these were the men who would decide whether the world would live or die. The atmosphere was suffocating. CIA analysts spread out reconnaissance photos on the table. Generals pointed to missile ranges drawn in heavy ink across maps of the United States. The conclusion was clear. The Soviets had placed nuclear weapons within striking distance of every major American city. The military men spoke first. Their voices were firm, impatient. Airstrikes, a full-scale invasion, crush the missile sites before they become operational. The logic was brutal but simple. Waiting meant risk. Every day the missiles remained in Cuba brought the Soviets closer to readiness. But Kennedy hesitated. He leaned back, listening as his generals pressed the case for war. An airstrike might destroy the missile sites, or it might not. Some would survive. And in retaliation, Khrushchev might strike Berlin. He might even unleash nuclear fire on American soil. The room grew tense. Every option carried a price too high to pay. Then came another voice, Robert Kennedy, the president's brother and attorney general. He urged caution. Before we attack, we should consider another path. The debate split the room in two. The hawks demanded immediate action. The doves pleaded for restraint. Kennedy said little, letting the storm rage around him, weighing each word, each recommendation. Finally, the president spoke. No airstrikes. Not yet. No invasion. Instead, a third option was placed on the table. A blockade, though Kennedy chose a different word: quarantine. A show of force that would stop Soviet ships from bringing more missiles to Cuba without firing the first shot. It was a gamble, a dangerous middle path between war and surrender, but it gave the Soviets time to reconsider, and it gave the world a chance. The decision was made. The crisis was no longer a secret within the walls of the White House. It was about to become the most terrifying drama of the Cold War, played out on the world stage. October 22nd, 1962. The evening news flickered on across America. Families gathered in living rooms, radios crackled in kitchens, television screens glowed in bars and dormitories. The President of the United States was about to speak. John F. Kennedy appeared on the screen, calm but grim. Behind his measured tone, the weight of the world hung heavy. "My fellow citizens," he began. The words were careful, deliberate. The Soviet Union had secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, weapons of sudden massive destruction, capable of reaching the United States in minutes. The room fell silent in homes across the country. Mothers clutched their children. Fathers sat frozen, staring at the screen. Across the Atlantic, Soviet officials listened too, their jaws tightening with each word. Kennedy announced his response. The United States would establish a naval quarantine around Cuba. Every ship bound for the island would be stopped and searched. No weapons would be allowed through. It was not a declaration of war, but it was close enough to taste. The world reacted instantly. In New York, United Nations diplomats scrambled for answers. In Moscow, Khrushchev's inner circle debated whether Kennedy was bluffing, and in Havana, Castro placed his forces on full alert, convinced that an American invasion was imminent. Then came the moment of truth. Soviet ships, freighters carrying unknown cargo, steamed steadily toward the line of U.S. warships encircling Cuba. On the morning of October 24th, radar screens lit up. Soviet vessels were closing in on the quarantine zone. American destroyers braced for orders. Fingers hovered near triggers. A single miscalculation, a single shot could ignite the war both sides feared. And then the unexpected happened. One by one, the Soviet ships slowed. Some stopped altogether. Others turned back. Khrushchev, at least for the moment, had chosen not to break the line. Relief swept through the Pentagon and the White House, but it was only temporary, because the missiles already in Cuba remained. They were being assembled, armed, readied for launch. The quarantine had bought time, but time was slipping away. As the quarantine tightened around Cuba, the world waited. Would Khrushchev back down, or would the Soviets push back and force Kennedy's hand? In Washington, the ExComm met daily, hour after hour. Tempers flared. The generals insisted that airstrikes were the only way to guarantee America's safety. The Soviets understand only force, they argued. But Kennedy resisted. If he struck first, the Soviets might retaliate, not in Cuba, but in Berlin, the very heart of Europe. And if Berlin fell, where would the escalation end? Each day brought new tension. Soviet cargo planes landed in Havana. Missile sites grew closer to completion. The clock was ticking. Then, on October 26th, a message arrived from Moscow. It was long, emotional, almost desperate. Khrushchev admitted that the missiles were there, but he offered a way out. If the United States pledged not to invade Cuba, the Soviets would remove their weapons. Hope flickered in Washington. Kennedy's advisors leaned in. Was this the solution they'd been waiting for? But the very next day, October 27th, a second letter arrived. This one was harsher, more aggressive. Khrushchev now demanded more. Not only must America promise never to invade Cuba, but it must also remove its own missiles from Turkey, weapons that had been aimed at the Soviet Union for years. The mood in the White House darkened. 2 letters, 2 conflicting offers. Which one was real? Which one reflected Khrushchev's true intent? Kennedy made his decision. He would answer only the first letter, the softer one. He would ignore the second. The gamble was clear. By appearing calm and measured, he might give Khrushchev a dignified path to retreat. But even as Kennedy drafted his reply, the crisis was spiraling out of control, because in the skies above Cuba, the first blood had been drawn. October 27th, 1962. The day the world came closest to nuclear war. At dawn, reports reached Washington. The missile sites in Cuba were nearing completion. The window to act was closing. The generals pressed harder. Mr. President, every hour we wait, the threat grows greater. Kennedy listened, but gave no order. Then disaster struck. At high altitude over Cuba, an American U-2 reconnaissance plane flew its mission as usual. Suddenly, a Soviet surface-to-air missile streaked upward. The explosion tore through the sky. The U-2 shattered, and its pilot, Major Rudolf Anderson, was killed instantly. In the White House, the news hit like thunder. A U.S. serviceman had been killed by Soviet fire. For the generals, this was the trigger. They demanded immediate retaliation. Bomb the missile sites, strike back, end this. But Kennedy refused. He saw the danger clearly. Anderson's death was not just a tragedy, it was a test. If the U.S. struck now, the Soviets would strike back. And once blood was spilled on both sides, there would be no way to contain the fire. As Kennedy wrestled with his advisors, another crisis unfolded, thousands of miles away. A second U-2 strayed off course during a routine flight near the North Pole. Its navigation failed, and it drifted deep into Soviet airspace. For tense minutes, Moscow tracked the American plane, suspecting it might be the prelude to a nuclear strike. Soviet fighters scrambled. U.S. jets armed with nuclear weapons scrambled in response. The skies above the Arctic teetered on the edge of Armageddon. And still, it wasn't over. Beneath the surface of the Caribbean, a Soviet submarine lurked in the quarantine zone. Harassed by U.S. Navy destroyers, cut off from Moscow, its captain believed war might already have begun. On board, conditions were brutal. Stifling heat, oxygen running low, nerves frayed to breaking. The captain prepared to arm a nuclear torpedo. Only one man, Vasili Arkhipov, the submarine's second-in-command, refused to consent. His voice, calm but unyielding, argued against launching. By Soviet protocol, the order required unanimous approval. Arkhipov's refusal may have been the single most important no in human history. He stopped a nuclear strike that could have triggered full-scale war. All of this in a single day. In Washington, Kennedy remained outwardly calm, but the weight was crushing. He now had Khrushchev's two letters before him, one offering peace, the other demanding concessions. His advisors pressed him for answers. The generals still pushed for war, but Kennedy chose restraint. He would respond only to the first letter. He would give Khrushchev an exit if he was willing to take it. The world had reached the breaking point. One more mistake, one more miscalculation, and history might have ended on that October day. As October 27th bled into the morning of the 28th, the world was exhausted. In Washington, Kennedy's advisors argued deep into the night. In Moscow, Khrushchev faced growing pressure from his own circle, furious that his gamble had nearly triggered disaster. Kennedy had made his choice. He ignored Khrushchev's harsher letter and instead replied to the first, the one that offered a way out. His message was firm but measured. The United States would pledge not to invade Cuba if the Soviets withdrew their missiles. But behind closed doors, a second deal was whispered. Quietly through back channels, Robert Kennedy met with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. The United States would also remove its own Jupiter missiles from Turkey, weapons that had threatened the Soviet Union for years. But this concession would remain secret, hidden from public view, to preserve America's image of strength. Now the decision rested in Moscow. Khrushchev, humiliated before his generals, faced a terrible choice: escalate further or step back. On October 28th, the message arrived. A Soviet broadcast crackled over the radio. Nikita Khrushchev had agreed. The missiles in Cuba would be dismantled and returned to the Soviet Union. In exchange, America promised never to invade Cuba. In Washington, the news brought relief so deep it was almost disbelief. Kennedy sat in silence, letting the words sink in. Across the United States, families who had been glued to their radios and televisions felt the weight lift, at least for now. The world had stared into the abyss, and, by the narrowest of margins, it had turned away. The Cuban Missile Crisis left scars that few could see, but none could forget. In the aftermath, Washington and Moscow installed a direct hotline, a red phone linking the White House to the Kremlin. Never again would the leaders of two superpowers risk miscommunication when the fate of the world was at stake. For Kennedy, the crisis cemented his legacy as a leader willing to resist both his enemies abroad and the hawks within his own circle. For Khrushchev, it was humiliation. Within 2 years, he would be removed from power, his gamble in Cuba remembered as reckless brinkmanship. And yet, both men had done something remarkable. They had pulled back. They had chosen not to launch the war that so many around them demanded. In that choice lay the survival of millions. But the crisis also revealed a darker truth. The world had not avoided nuclear war through strength or strategy or even diplomacy alone. It had avoided war through luck. A single pilot, a single submarine officer, a single letter chosen over another. The thinnest of margins stood between civilization and catastrophe. For 13 days, the world held its breath, and when it exhaled, the Cold War continued, a shadow over generations to come. And that, like so many stories we uncover here on the dusty ledger, is history's reminder that the past is never truly past. It lingers,